Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we're back with another edition of our educational speedrun series. So without further ado, let's jump right into the action with a 10-minute rapid game.
Zooming through the game with the bomb cloud start, trashing all your prep like it's modern art. Night on the rim, he'll still find the win. Chat's going wild, bro thinks he's Hikaru again. Oh hey, hey, he's smurfing play-by-play, beats you blindfolded, still sipping latte. Queens are flying, egos meet defeat, just another speed run on Hikaru Street.
So here we go. We get the white piece in the first game. I'm going to play the move d4. At this point, we are now at the 1300 level. We're trying to keep progressing pretty quickly. I expect to not win games in the openings as frequently, but nonetheless, if I do, so be it. All right, so we're going to play the London system, very standard system. I do like it at the beginner level. I think it's very easy to learn plans. You bring the bishop out, you put the pawn here. Now you have both diagonals, and now we get the move e6. Now my opponent has made a slight inaccuracy, just very slightly, by locking in this bishop behind the pawns. You'll notice the bishop simply does not have any scope here. So slight inaccuracy, not the end of the world, but not completely the best way of playing it. So I'm going to play the move c3, just building this classic pawn formation here. c3 maybe isn't necessary, but the reason I'm playing c3 is if I were to go bishop d3 right away, which is very thematic, there is knight b4 to harass the bishop. So by playing the move c3, now I can go bishop d3. There's no knight b4. The pawn covers a square. So now this bishop has great scope on the diagonal. So you get bishop d6. Now I could trade the bishops here. In a lot of these London systems, generally when you have the option to trade the bishops, I would say that you usually do not trade the bishops, and the main reason is because what black is trying to do here, through I would say actually through his own fault, is this bishop is so passive behind the pawns that if black can go e5, you open up this great diagonal for the bishop. And if I trade the bishops here after queen takes, black is going to play e5 to open up the diagonal. So I'm actually going to do a knight f3 here. Now I will cover the square with the pawn, the bishop, and the knight. I have 1 2 3 to cover this, so black can't push the pawn. If my opponent chooses to trade the bishops here, this pawn will never be able to advance, as we'll see, because now I'm just gripping the square with the pawns and the knight, meaning that this bishop on c8 is now a very bad piece. So I'm going to castle, finish my development on the king side. I'm hoping to bring the knight to d2 and then activate this rook down the road. We're very early in the game, so it's maybe not going to happen instantly, but let's go knight d2. Now the reason white is better here is that in the center of the board I have this great bishop on the diagonals, and black has this bishop that is simply walled in by the pawns. So I'm going to go rook to e1, and at some point here I think I'm going to play knight to e5. Now I get this nice knight in the center of the board. I'm hoping to bring my queen over, although wait, this knight is guarded by a lone pawn. I can take, and I hit this with both the knight and the bishop. That's 2, and this is 1. This is just a free pawn unless I'm missing something here. Yeah, it's just a free pawn here. For up a pawn, my opponent's bishop is still very bad behind the pawns. The rook on 8 also not in the game here, so I have a massive advantage. On top of that, one of the things that you'll see a lot in the London system is weaknesses on the light squares. From the get-go, when I put this bishop on d3, you're always looking to create threats on the diagonals. As we look at this position here, this bishop is very bad, but there are going to be a lot of threats on the light square. So I'm going to go knight to f3 here, maybe bring the knight to the center, maybe the knight can jump. We get queen b6, and now I'm just going to play rook to b1, quiet move guarding this pawn from being captured. Okay, my opponent attacks the pawn, and now I'm going to play this move g3, reinforcing the pawn here. It might look a little bit weak because now my king here could be open, but currently my opponent has no way of attacking the king. This bishop, light square bishop, has no way of getting on any of these diagonals, so my king is actually completely safe here. On top of that, g3 in the long run also creates a square for the king, so there will be no back rank checkmates towards the king as well. So we get bishop d7. I guess I'm going to go knight to e5 here, bring the knight to the center. We also get this nice pyramid formation to connect through with the pawns, and then the knight as well at the front. This is simply a very, very bad position, and mainly it's because on top of the material disadvantage or material advantage I have, this bishop is just so bad. So I'm just going to take the knight, free pawn here. Let's recapture. I'm now up 2 pawns in this position. I have 8 versus 6. Again, it might look like my king is weak here, but there's no way for black to attack on the light squares. Get c5. Okay, now my opponent is threatening to put a bishop on this diagonal, so I'm just happy to trade. We're going to win another pawn. We're going to be up 3 pawns here now. We have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. My opponent has 1 2 3 4 5. Get queen c6, and now I'm just going to go rook to e5. Reason being, both the pawn and the rook are under attack. I go here, rook guards the pawn, queen can't capture, and there's no rook that's hanging any longer. So the 3-pawn advantage here, everything's looking very, very good for me. My idea here is to use the open files. I'm going to line up a legendary triple stack, try to win this pawn on e6, and with all these extra pawns, eventually the material advantage will lead to a decisive victory for me. So we get the move queen d5. This unfortunately just ends the game. I just take the queen. I think my opponent missed this. It's a rather anticlimactic way for this game to end. It's not what I was hoping for. But let's go through the game very quickly. So as we go through the game, let's take a look at the analysis here. Let's go back to the start. One of the things, if you're playing from the black side and you're facing the London, is generally if you want to bring this knight out, you want to put a pawn on c5 first. And the main reason is because now with the knight behind this pawn, you try to apply a lot of pressure towards this pawn while also potentially trying to play e5 down the road here. Because in the game, when we get knight c6, now black has no way to attack this pawn chain without getting an e5. Your knight is in front of this pawn, so knight is never targeting this pawn. And this is already, as you can tell from the valuation bar, significantly worse for black from the get-go. So if you're playing from the black side, I would always recommend that you look to play c5 and then knight c6 in a London type system here. Actually, just in general, if you're facing the move d4 on move 1, if we go back to like d4, for example, I would almost never suggest putting a knight on c6 in front of this pawn. For example, if you get something like this, for example, this is great with the knight behind the pawn, but I would really just never recommend that you ever bring a knight out with the pawn behind it, unless you're playing a meme opening, something where you immediately get something to attack in the center. So for example, say you play something like the England Gambit here. In this position, it's very reasonable because if you were to push a pawn, this pawn doesn't really attack anything here in the center. So if you play something like the England Gambit, for example, then bringing the knight out in front of the pawn makes sense. But in a traditional d4 d5, both these pawns out, I would say you should never bring this knight out in front of this pawn. So getting forward to the game, get e6 here. Probably I would recommend playing bishop to f5 and then e6 here, because after we get this position, I play c3, not bishop d3, because I was worried about knight before attacking this bishop. So I go c3. It stops the knight before idea, it reinforces pawn center, and it gives me this great square on d3 for the bishop on the next turn. So we go here, bishop d6, and now I play knight f3 here. If I were to trade the bishops, black actually supposed to take with the pawn, surprisingly, and the reason for that here is that I have no way to stop this e5 pawn push. So now you get this big black center, the bishop has scope on the diagonal, and black apparently has the advantage. If black were to take with the queen here, white can play the move f4 here, stopping the pawn thrust, and again this bishop is hemmed in by the 2 pawns, so the bishop is not a great piece here. And after say castles, knight f3, castles, knight e5, knight bd2, white is just significantly better in my opinion. Now a computer will say black is fine here, but in a human level, this is much easier to play for white, and especially at a beginner level. If you know what you're doing here with white, just to illustrate the ideas here, you play like knight bd2, knight e5, rook f3, rook h3, all kinds of big threats here. White is doing great. Queen e1, queen h4 is an idea as well. This is just very, very tough to play. Whereas black has no concrete ideas. But for anybody who's more advanced and wondering why the computer does not give white a huge advantage in this position here, it's because black can actually play knight to e7, and after castles you can play the move c5 here. Now you're trying to potentially create some weaknesses here in the center, and after a move like knight d2, now black can apparently play takes and something like b6, bishop b7, and rook c8. Maybe black's not even better here, but black is in the game. All right, so back to our game. We get takes here. In this position, queen to e7 would actually be the best move, trying to force in this e5 pawn push. If you can get this position here, black would be completely fine because the bishop is on an open diagonal. Black will finish development and we'll have a normal middle game. Instead, we got bishop takes f4 here, and now after pawn takes, you'll notice that this pawn push is never going to happen because the square is over protected by the 2 pawns and the knight here. So already here, this bishop on c8 is going to be a very sad piece for the long run. So we get h6, I castle, knight d2, a6, rook e1. Now I go knight e5, and here we get knight g6. This is simply a blunder, but it's already very hard to play for black at this point. Queen d6 trying to play c5, or b6 trying to play c5 would be the best attempt, but it's still a very bad position here. Computer actually wants g4, g5, but even from a general human perspective, say queen f3, c5, and now something like queen to h3 with g4, g5, potentially. I apparently can't draw my arrows, or rook e3, rook g3, and there are all kinds of threats on the king side. So we get knight g6 is just a blunder because it loses the pawn here. If this pawn were on h7, for example, so we go back here just to set it up, something like castles, knight e7, rook e1, a6, knight e5, and knight g6 here. I actually would not take the knight, because if I take the knight here after takes, white is still better, but I would probably just go g3 here, keeping this knight on the board and hoping for a trade where this bishop becomes a monster on the diagonal. All right, so we get this knight e7 blunder here. I end up a pawn. We get knight f3, protect, knight e5, we get knight e4. At this point, it's already very hard to play. Probably bishop d8 is the best move, and most likely I would play bishop c2 here with the idea of queen d3, threatening these checkmates on the diagonal, and it's just a miserable position for black to play. We get knight e4, I take, we get c5, up 3 pawns, queen e2, queen d5. This loses right away. Black should probably try to play something like rook e8 here, but after rook b to e1 with this legendary triple stack, white is completely winning. Let's say we get like, I don't even know what a good move would be here, like king f7 or something. Probably you can just go f5 here, and after takes, I think the end game is winning if you trade everything off here. I could be wrong on this, because you've got 2 extra pawns, so you can play something like king g2, king d7, king f3, trying to go for this pawn, and after g5 you simply go king e3, king d4. You have 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. Black has 5 pawns. King can just march to the king side here, very easily winning king and pawn endgame. Instead, we get queen d5, just doing a Botez gambit. I take, and now my opponent resigns the game. So let's move on. Next game, here we go. We now get the black pieces, and my opponent starts with the move e4. So in this game, I'm going to play the move c5. I'm going to play a Sicilian here. As I've mentioned a few times, I think c5, c6, d5 and e5 are probably the 4 moves that I recommend. Don't really like the French, so either you should play, just to go back, I know I'll lose time here, Sicilian, Caro-Kann, center counter, Scandinavian opening, or the move e5. These are probably the 4 moves that I recommend. Anything else I wouldn't recommend until you're at a more advanced level. So we get knight to f3. Now the system that I'm going to play here is actually a system I think is very flexible at the beginner level. I'm going to go knight c6. We're probably going to get d4 here. We're going to get an open Sicilian is what I expect, or at least what I hope. We get knight c3, fair enough. And now I'm going to play the move g6. Now at the beginner level, I actually think these accelerated dragon systems are very easy to play, because the development is very simple. You want to bring the bishop, the knight, and castle your king here. We go bishop g7. Now my opponent doesn't have d4 because I'm covering it with the pawn, the knight, and the bishop. I have 3. White has 2 to cover this square, whereas I have 3, so white can't go d4 anymore. Position still very normal. We get knight g5. Now my opponent is trying to cheese me here, trying to put up a quick double attack on this pawn. Looks nice in theory. This actually is just going to help me finish my development though, because I'm going to go e6. No threat towards the pawn. I hit the knight, and now I can bring my knight and castle the king and push this pawn very quickly. My opponent's going to have to remove the knight backwards. I'm going to get a lot of these quick moves. I'll gain time, or tempo as they say in chess lingo, and my opponent's position is already headed downhill. Now I'm surprised to see this even at this level where my opponent has a rating of 1295, because I would expect the openings to be a bit more standard, but this shows why openings can go a long way towards avoiding disaster at the beginning of the game. So I'm gonna go knight e7. The reason I'm gonna play this move is my knight is going to support this pawn thrust with d5 here. I can also castle my king next turn. h6 was also a very reasonable move just to kick this knight out of town right away. Okay, now I'm gonna what do I want to do? I'm gonna kick this knight out of town with the pawn. My king guards the pawn, of course, so the knight has no captures. Knight's got to go home, and immediately you're going to see that there's an unfortunate fork here for my opponent. I go d5, the pawn, the knight, and the queen guard, so I take. White has 2 attacking, I have 2 defending. White can't take without losing a piece. Although white will lose the piece anyway, as we're about to see, because when this bishop goes away to one of these 2 squares, I'm going to be able to push this pawn and fork the bishop and the knight, so white is going to lose some material here. Now the main reason this has happened is specifically because my opponent tried to cheese me way too early in the game when it was unwarranted. Okay, my opponent moves the bishop, smart move, doesn't hang it, but now after d4, the pawn on d4 forks the bishop and the knight, the other pawn guards it. White is going to lose either the bishop or the knight for 1 pawn, and disaster has struck. So we get knight takes pawn, terrible move. I just take back, and now unfortunately my opponent has given up a knight for a pawn, but there's still the pawn on d4 forking these 2 pieces. Now I simply have 4 pieces versus 2. I have 2 extra minor pieces, and I should win this game pretty soon. I'm just going to castle here, finish my development with all these extra pieces. That's really not in doubt what the result's going to be. We get queen d2 trying to hit the pawn. I'm just going to drop my bishop back, guarding this pawn. I also, by bringing the bishop back and guarding, free up the square for the pony. So now the pony will jump to the center. Okay, now I'm going to go bishop e6. More than happy to create these even trades since I have so much more material here. So I'm more than happy for these even exchanges of the minor pieces, getting the bishops and the knights off the board. So I'll pre-move the capture. I don't know if we'll get it, but I'll pre-move it. Okay, we get the trade. Now with the bishops off, we still have 2 extra pieces in this position. I'm going to look to bring the rook to one of these open files. Just go here. Maybe could have maybe taken the pawn, but no need. Just bring the rooks to the center. My opponent here has what exactly? 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. 1 2 3 4 5. So my opponent has 2 pawns here in the center of the board in return for the bishop and the knight. Of course, 2 does not equal 6. So now I'm going to look to force a trade of the knights here because I'm hitting both the pawn and the knight. Probably will get the trade. Again, very happy to get this even trade because now I just have the bishop and the knight versus the 2 pawns. Many ways to win here, but I'm going to keep it very simple. I'm just going to drop the rook back. Now, anyone who's a more advanced player will notice that I could take this pawn because after pawn takes, I would win this queen on d2. But we're going to keep it very simple here. We're going to drop the rook back. We have an extra bishop and a knight for these 2 central pawns, and we're just going to try to win this game in a standard fashion. Let's go here. Let's stack, target the pawn. Okay, so we get rook b3. Now I'm going to go rook e8, and one thing that's important, it's not necessarily something you incorporate into your games if you're a complete beginner, is generally when you look at the rooks are the hardest piece to understand because generally they belong on open files, and in this case it's very easy because there are really only 2 open files here for the rooks. Like there is kind of a half open C file, but the only really open files are this completely open E file and this D file here, so it's easy to understand where these rooks belong. But in general, it's the toughest piece to maneuver in the game of chess if you're not a very advanced player when there aren't many open files. But when there are, you should always be thinking about when can you put the rooks or the queen on these open lines. The rooks actually more so than the queen, like we have here, because now what's going to happen is I'm actually going to completely dominate this file. I'm about to put the double stack, and this is the only open file here. So with the only open file being dominated by the rooks, I'm definitely well on my way to a victory. I think I'm going to actually make this pre-move. It's a little bit risky perhaps, but I expect my opponent to move the rook. We go rook to e2. Knight to e2 would have won the game, but I'm just going to show the power of the rooks on the open lane. Okay, let's put the double stack here on this open lane. I might even create the legendary triple stack here with queen to e8 next turn, trying to really ram home on this e file that's completely open and dominated by the 2 rooks. Let's go queen to e8. Now this is what is known as the legendary triple stack, the only open file, and I have my rooks and my queen all on it here. With the 3 pieces on this open file here, it's just perfect place. When we get the move rook to c1, that's actually a reasonable move. I'm gonna go guess I'm gonna go h5. I want to like move this bishop and hit this rook on c1 if I can, because my opponent is stopping me from playing rook to e1 here. Let's go here, attack the rook with the bishop. So my opponent goes rook to b1. Now I'm going to play rook d2 here because the bishop guards the rook on this diagonal. It's actually my opponent's going to lose the queen here because the queen does not have any squares available. The knight covers both these squares. Pawn covers this square. And if the queen goes over, I can simply play knight to e2, checking the king and ending the game. So white's going to lose the queen. I don't know if my opponent will resign here or play another 1 or 2 moves, but the game is going to conclude very shortly. So we get queen c1. Now I play knight to e2, forking the king and the queen. Okay, my opponent resigns very quickly. So let's go through this game. So this opening that I was mentioning, this accelerated dragon, normally white will play the move d4, and after takes and g6 here, the idea is to play bishop g7. It's a very flexible and easy opening to play. I know the evaluation bar is going to say that white has a substantial advantage, but you can completely ignore that for the time being. The reason I really like these systems are because you want to move this bishop, move the knight, and castle your king. Normally white will play something like knight c3 and bishop e3, but now you can go knight to f6 and castle immediately, which is very, very easy to understand the theme. And if you get some position like this, for example, you can even play d5 to try and open up the center, open up the diagonals, or just play something like d6, bishop d7, and rook to c8 to play on the open file. So the flexible development of the pieces is very easy if you play the system. So I do recommend it. I've played it a few times in the speedrun already. My opponent went bishop c4, not best. We got this, and now we got knight g5 going for the big cheese here. At this point, white is already a little bit worse because without this d4 move here, black is gripping the center a bit more. Say you get castles, for example, probably I can even go e6 and then something like knight e7 and d5 anyway, similar to the game. But the main point here is that black has a bit more space in the center, so black should be very slightly better. But we get knight g5. Now this move is just going for pure cheese with the knight and the bishop hitting the pawn. I play the move e6, closing the diagonal. Now if takes, I take because there's a pawn in the way of the diagonal. And so we get the move d3. I play knight e7. Perhaps I should play h6 first just to kick this knight back before trying to complete the development, but I just decided to go knight e7. It's important to note there is flexibility here. So for example, after castles, I like this move e6 to play knight e7 and d5 playing for the center. d6 is also very reasonable here, followed by knight to f6 and castles, but you have the option of where you want to put the knight. The only thing I would be caution against is that there are other openings I've mentioned before. I think I've mentioned some of these openings like e4, e5. Is it e4, e5? I feel like I'm not sure which opening, but there's some e4, e5 openings where when you bring the knight to f6, you'd be very cautious and aware of this pawn push to distract the knight and hamper the black development. And that's why in this game, what I was trying to mention is after castles and the move d6 here, when you play knight f6, you need to make sure white doesn't have this e5 move, because after e5 you can simply trade everything off the board here and just play the position. I guess I don't even know what's best. Queen d6 hitting the rook and guarding the pawn. The point is, if you were to play it right away, say knight f6 here, now white can actually maybe play e5, attacking this knight right away. And if you go to like h5, for example, the knight's on the rim after rook to e1. It's still fine for black, but it's tricky to play. You don't have the basic fundamentals to follow. So that's why d6 makes sense, because once you go d6, there's no e5, and now you can just play knight f6 and castle the king. So you do have that option in this game, because my opponent put the knight out right away to g5 here. And then we got d3. I was actually able to put this knight on e7 instead of f6, and now I can try to play for the center with d5. Bishop e3, I kick. Probably here white should castle, just a sample of how to play this position here. Probably d5, bishop b3, something like castles, h3, and then b6 here. You're going to go for bishop b7. You want to have the double fianchetto here with the two bishops on the diagonal. Again, this is a middle game position. It's hard to explain the exact plans because it depends on what white does, but probably in the long run, what you're looking to do is if white were to trade on d5, for example, you're looking to maybe put this bishop here, bring the rooks to the center. So just a sample line to illustrate the point. Something like this with rook e8 and then rook d8, and then maybe like knight f5 and knight to d4, perhaps something along these lines. It's not like there's anything super concrete about this. If white were to play something like rook to e1, another way of playing this, maybe just bishop b7. Let's say white were to go bishop f4. You can probably play a6 with the idea of b5 and c4 here to create this big clump of the pawns. This is one idea. You can also play something like knight to a5 here, trying to open up the diagonal and trade this knight for the bishop at the same time. None of this is conclusively winning or obviously easy to play in terms of plans, but it is a position where black should be better. All right, so we have time for one more game. Let's get going. Here we go with the black pieces. Again, I'm going to play the Sicilian defense. Why not? Let's go knight c6. Okay, now we get the move bishop b5. Now, this is what is known as the Rossolimo. This is a system that is much more advanced, usually not played at beginner level. Usually at the beginner level, almost everybody is going to play d4 or something like knight c3 and then d4. But we get bishop b5. Now, as I mentioned before, I like this move g6 here for the themes. I just want to fianchetto the bishop to g7. So we get knight c3. I'm going to play bishop g7 here. Now white cannot play d4 again, much like the previous game. I'm holding the square with the pawn, the knight, and the bishop. So we get castles. Now I have some options here in terms of what I want to do, but the big difference between this position and the previous game is that there is this bishop on b5. In the previous game, the bishop was on c4 here. With the bishop on b5, if I were to play e6, this actually would be a very serious positional error, so I'm not going to play it. I will, of course, explain it after the game. But in this case, what I'm going to play here is I'm going to play this move d6. And the reason I'm going to play this is I want to go knight f6, but if I were to go knight f6 right away, there's this e5 idea again. So we get knight d5. Additionally, by pushing the pawn forward, I now open this diagonal for the bishop. Okay, we get knight d5. Now it's funny that we get knight d5 because here I'm going to play e6, trying to kick this knight out of town. I don't really understand this move for my opponent. It's a very strange move. My opponent could trade here or move the knight back. I'll explain the difference in terms of after the game why this would have been much worse than this current position where you're probably thinking, well, can't he take? You pushed a pawn. I'll explain it after. So I'm going to go knight g7 again. I'm going to protect this knight with the knight. I'm going to castle my king here. And the big issue here that at least to me, that I perceive is my opponent doesn't have obvious plans. This is why the opening is really important, and the plans you have really make a big difference. We get the move c3 now. This is a good move, trying to play d4, I think, to build this white center. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to play e5. And the reason I'm going to play e5 is I attack the knight, but now I'm gripping the square with both the pawns, the knight, and the bishop down the road. I'm going to castle here. With 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces covering the square, I don't think this move is playable. It might still be a possibility, but I'm covering it more squares than white is guarding it with. White has 1, 1, 2, and 3, whereas I have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we get d3. I'm going to trade the knights. We're going to go knight to e7, attacking the pawn here. We get the move c4, and now what I'm going to play is I'm going to play this move h6. Now this is actually something I've probably never gone over in these videos as part of the speed run, but this has actually turned into a structure that's very similar to the King's Indian, and this is why it's important as you progress the game, you become an intermediate, maybe advanced player, you play different openings, because in this position the move that would normally be played is f5 in the King's Indian style. I have a pawn here, I've got the fianchettoed bishop, but I'm actually going to go h6, and the reason for this is if I were to play f5 right away here, white has knight to g5 and potentially can jump with the knight to e6. This is a pretty advanced concept. I'll explain it after the game, of course, in terms of why this is so important here. But by going h6, I take away the square, so now I'm free to start rushing the pawns here on the king side. And this is going to be very hard for white to play, also because in the center white can't push the pawn. I'm covering the square. You have these pawns that are clogged here, so I have a free hand to start pushing everything on the king side, and this is probably going to go downhill very, very quickly for my opponent. So I'm going to play f5, no knight g5 here. The pawn covers the square, so knight can't get into e6. My only intention here is just to push the pawns. You might be thinking, well, why do you close the diagonal? Bishop belongs here. In this position, because of the placement of the pawns, specifically in the center of the board here, these 3 pawns for each side, and the fact there's an imbalance and this pawn is shifted away. Because this pawn is shifted away, I have this imbalance of the pawns here. This is a terrible move because now I go g5, covering the square, I'm guarding the pawn. And now we go knight g6. I'm intending to play g4 and f4 very, very quickly here, but with this clump of pawns and the fact that white is captured away, it gives me this 4-on-3 on the king side, majority of these 4 pawns versus these 3 pawns. So because of that, with this 4 versus 3 here in this imbalance and white having no way to attack in the center, I just simply have free hand to push everything here, and this is probably going to end very, very badly for my opponent. One thing that beginners are especially bad at is trying to defend. I would say that's something that's very difficult. b4, however, is a great attempt to create complications. Now, if I were playing a serious game, this move would be losing, so I could go e4 to open up a diagonal here. If I go e4, I hit the knight and the rook. Question is, do I want to do that? And actually, I think I will just do it because it's the best move here, and it's a theme that you should see occasionally in games, even at beginner level. I'm going to take the pawn. Bishop hits the rook, pawn hits the knight here. One of these 2 pieces is going to fall off the board on the next turn. Worth pointing out, of course, that here I could have just taken the rook. For anybody who's wondering, I could have just gone bishop takes rook, but I took instead. We get knight e1. Now I'll take the rook. Extra rook on the board. White's pieces here not really very active. This bishop is on an open diagonal doing nothing here. My king is going to be pretty safe here with the knight, the pawns, everything in front of it. So material is going to play very, very soon. We get takes. I will just gladly take the pawn back. You get the move queen to e3. Okay, so I'm just going to go bishop d4. Pawn guards the bishop. Great diagonal. Maybe I have queen to e7 if I wanted to guard both the pawns here. Maybe I could have played queen to e7 to guard both against the queen capture, but this is still fine because now I go bishop to f5, activating the bishop. I'm going to bring the queen and hopefully bring the rook to the center of the board very soon. We get queen to e2. Just gonna what do I want to do here? I guess I'll just go queen f6. Why not? Bringing the queen closer to put more pressure on this f2 point. I have a queen, a bishop, and a rook, potentially 3 pieces lined up towards it. Let's go here, pin the knight. Also, I'm opening up this file now for the double stack here. This game should end pretty soon. You get queen e6, just a Botez gambit. I just drop the bishop back, collect the queen. That's going to be GG here, and my opponent resigns. All right, back to the opening. So my opponent played bishop b5. This is what is known as the Rossolimo system. Not something I would ever recommend at the beginner level, unless you happen to have a very quick c3 d4 idea to build a big white center. If you know the line and you're going to play something like, let's say, castles, bishop g7, and like c3 d4 right away, and you've actually looked at some course on this variation, it's playable. But unless you're going to play a c3 d4 system where you immediately start pushing in the center and trying to create play before black is able to complete the development here, I do not recommend playing the system, because it becomes very, very much about maneuvering. The plans are not easy. They're slightly easier for black than white for sure, but not easy for either side. It's just not what I recommend. Also, because generally you end up with pieces that are lacking in development until you're well into the middle game. So we got knight c3. Now I stop d4 here. We get castles, and now I played the move d6. We get knight d5. Bad move here. One thing I mentioned was e6 here. The reason this move would be very bad is after takes, and the move e5 here. Suddenly these pawns are doubled. There also are all these Swiss cheese holes in the position. The knight is jumping very, very quickly here, and white is actually much better, as you can tell from the valuation part. If white, after d6, say white were to take here, you'll notice that I still have the pawns on d6 and e7 here. So in this position, I'm still happy to develop my knight and castle my king. We got knight d5, e6, and now we got knight f4. You're probably thinking, why can't white take here? If white takes, you'll notice the knight is under attack 2 ways, and when the knight goes back here, I can simply play this move e5 here. It stops d4, it stops e5. The pawns are very solid, and we're gonna have something very similar to the game where I move the knight, castle, push f5, and very, very quickly everything is going to start rushing up the board on the king side here. So we get knight f4. I go knight e7, c3. I played e5. I castled. We got d3 here. Probably white should have played something like takes and tried to play, like, I was going to say play d4, maybe d3 here. Still feels very, very unpleasant with f5 incoming at any rate. We got d3. I traded, went here, and now I went h6. f5 is a move that might be completely fine here, but the point is, for people who are beginners who might not have seen the structure before, in this case knight g5 is not actually a very good move, because I can simply go h6. I think I can take and then play something like knight c6 with queen e7 or queen c8 to win this pawn. But generally, playing f5 in a situation where your opponent has a pawn on d5 and a knight can jump is bad. So I want you guys to try and remember that, to internalize that as a general rule. You're probably thinking, what am I talking about? Specifically, normally the way you get these structures is out of the King's Indian defense, something like this. Castles, bishop e2, let's say e5, castles, something like this, just to show you guys a sample line, something like this, for example. And generally in this position with this pawn structure where white has these central pawns, if you go f5 too early, white can play this knight g5, knight e6, and generally it's considered to be very, very bad for black in the long run, because what happens is generally you end up with this bishop that's very, very passive behind the pawns, and you're never actually able to win this pawn on e6. So say you go queen c8, for example. Actually here you win the pawn because you can take, the knight on e8 guards this pawn on c7, but still you'll notice here that after like queen d5, white is much better. It's not so much about the specific line, it's about the fact that you don't want to allow your opponent to get knight g5 and knight to e6 when you have pawns on this king side and you have fianchettoed bishop on this diagonal. So back to the game. All right, so we get this position here. F5 would have been fine, but I played h6 to stop knight g5. I go f5. We get knight h4, just a bad move here. At this point, white's really in trouble. White can try like rook b1 to go b4, so you don't run into this e4 tactic like in the game. But after a6, something like b5, black is just much better. Let's say you get takes and takes. I think there's knight takes d5 here. Even something very simple, I would say, like a5 is possible, stop b4. And again, you're just going to start pushing these pawns on the king side, and it's a very, very bad situation. In fact, actually, I would recommend playing a5 just to stop this b4 altogether. The 2 pawns stop this. Whereas if white is able to play something like b4, it's still very good for black. But you'll notice here that after takes, there's something like bishop to a3. There's pressure on this diagonal. There's pressure on the b file. White gets some counterplay. So we got knight h4. I played g5, brought the knight over. g4 here was my initial idea, but white can maybe slide the knight to h4. So by going here, I want to push, and I want to cover the square from the knight being able to move. So now we got b4, which effectively loses on the spot, but it's already very bad. If white plays knight to e1 here, again, I like this move a6 and then a5, stopping b4. Let's say white plays rook b1. Now you go f4, just to illustrate why this is so bad. b3, you go g4, h5, h4, f3. White just has very, very passive pieces here. No pieces are in the game. It's not like there's a forced way to win this necessarily, but you can even play something like queen to h4 here. And after, say, like queen to d1, you can even go f3. There's knight f4. There's also even something like rook to f5, rook h5, setting up a double stack with a checkmate. It's just dire straits for white. Most likely, the important thing to remember is you want to get these pawns to the 4th rank, and then you sort of have carte blanche. You can push the h pawn down. You can push g3 as well. You can also go rook f5 with queen h4, but you definitely want these 2 pawns on these 2 squares before you continue with the attack, whether it be any of those ideas. At any rate, we got b4, which allows me to play e4 here. Now I open up the scope for the bishop. I attack the knight. We get takes. Could have just taken the rook right away, but I decided to take instead. Now, again, the knight is still under attack. The rook is still under attack. We got knight e1. Doesn't really matter what white does here. It's just losing anyway. We got the trade. Played bishop d4. Takes. Bishop f5. Knight f3. And now we got the blunder with queen e6 here. But the game is basically over anyway. After, say, queen to e4, you can simply take. And now play something like knight to e5 or knight to h4. Either square, just hitting this pawn on f3. And white is going to lose the game due to being down a rook. Instead, we got queen e6. I took the queen. That ended the game. And with that, we conclude another edition of our speedrun. Now, again, like a lot of our previous videos, one thing that continues to surprise me is even though we're now past the 1300 mark, we still see a lot of blunders in the opening. I'm not necessarily doing anything super fancy or exciting. I'm just following basic opening themes, but this also does show why if you have a good understanding of these openings, these very easy, simple ideas to play, your opponents will make a lot of blunders, and you can get to a pretty advanced level rating wise just because of that. So that's going to do it for this edition of our educational speedrun series. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with more great content in the near future. See you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.